Dutch van der Linde's downfall in Red Dead Redemption 2 isn't sudden. It's a slow unraveling built on pride, paranoia, and the crushing weight of failure. At the beginning, Dutch is magnetic. He believes in freedom, in protecting the gang, in giving everyone a better life. For Arthur and John, he's more than a leader. He's almost a father. But every choice he makes after the Blackwater Ferry robbery begins to expose cracks in that perfect image. The ferry job is where it all starts. Dutch's plan fails, people die, and the gang is forced to flee into the mountains. Instead of admitting he miscalculated, Dutch convinces himself it was just bad luck. That denial sets the stage for everything that follows. When Colm O'Driscoll is caught, Dutch refuses Arthur's plea to end the feud peacefully. Pride won't let him. He can't back down to his rival, even if it puts the gang in danger. In St. Denis, his spiral deepens. The bank heist should have been the moment that saved the gang. Instead, it's a disaster. Hosea, his oldest friend and moral compass, is executed in front of him. You can feel Dutch snap. Losing Hosea means losing the one person who could talk sense into him. From that moment on, Dutch stops listening. His paranoia grows, and he starts pushing away anyone who questions him. On Guarma, his behavior becomes even more erratic. He leads the gang into helping a rebellion, not out of loyalty or principle, but because he wants to prove he's still in control. He starts to confuse recklessness with leadership, and you can see Arthur's trust in him start to crumble. Back in the States, Dutch becomes obsessed with the one last job fantasy. Whether it's the train robbery with Cornwall, the trolley station job, or the attack on the army, every plan gets bigger and riskier. Each time, Dutch insists this will fix everything. But the truth is, he's chasing a dream that's already dead. America is changing. Railroads, oil, and government control are swallowing the outlaw way of life. And Dutch can't accept it. Then there's Micah. Micah feeds Dutch's ego, telling him he's always right, poisoning him against Arthur and John. When Arthur gets sick and starts questioning Dutch's choices, Dutch sees it as betrayal. Instead of valuing Arthur's honesty, he clings to Micah's lies because they let him hold on to his illusion of control. That's why he abandons Arthur on the mountain. Not just because Arthur defied him, but because Arthur reminded him of a truth Dutch couldn't face, that he had lost his way. By the end, Dutch is unrecognizable. The man who once spoke about loyalty sacrifices his family for pride. The man who dreamed of freedom becomes a tyrant in his own gang. His decisions are no longer about survival. They're about proving he was never wrong. And that's what makes his decline so tragic. Dutch isn't just a villain. He's a man destroyed by his own ideals, by his refusal to adapt, and by his fear of being left behind in a world he no longer understands. Dutch's story is a slow collapse, and that's why it hits so hard. You don't just see him fall. You see him lose the trust of the people who loved him most. And in the end, he's left with nothing but empty words and a dream that died long before he did. The Blackwater Ferry Job is one of the most mysterious and defining events in Red Dead Redemption 2. It's the moment that everything starts to fall apart for the van der Linde gang. And while we never see the robbery firsthand, the story of what happened echoes through almost every conversation and mission afterward. By the time the game begins, the gang is already reeling from its failure, and Dutch's so-called last big score has instead become the beginning of the end. Dutch had promised that the ferry job would be their retirement plan. The rumor was that a fortune in cash and bonds was being transported out of Blackwater on that boat, enough to finally let them leave the outlaw life behind and head somewhere far away, free from the law. Hosea, Arthur, and others were skeptical, warning that Blackwater wasn't the kind of frontier town they could bully or outsmart. It was a booming, modern city, filled with lawmen, citizens, and Pinkertons nearby. Pulling a stunt in a place like that was reckless. But Dutch was stubborn, and his charisma kept the gang in line. To him, this was the moment that would cement his legacy. We don't get every detail of how the robbery went down, but what we do know is that it turned into a bloodbath. Innocent civilians were caught in the crossfire, lawmen were killed, and the gang itself paid dearly. Jenny Kirk, a longtime member, was killed during the chaos. Davy Calander was shot and mortally wounded, only surviving long enough to die while the gang fled into the snowy mountains. These weren't nameless losses. These were friends and companions, part of the family that Dutch claimed to protect. Their deaths weighed heavily on the survivors, and not everyone blamed the law. Some quietly began to blame Dutch. Dutch would later claim they were betrayed, or that something unexpected happened, that the robbery was sabotaged, or the law knew about it in advance. But Arthur and Hosea both hint throughout the story that Dutch simply miscalculated. He underestimated how quickly the law would respond in a growing place like Blackwater. Worse, when things started to go wrong, instead of cutting his losses, Dutch doubled down. He refused to admit failure, and that refusal left more bodies in its wake. The consequences were enormous. The ferry job didn't just fail, it branded the entire gang as enemies of Blackwater. They could never return there again. The Pinkertons immediately took charge of hunting them down, fueled by the outrage of civilians gunned down in the robbery. From that point onward, the gang was no longer living outside the reach of society. They were being chased, hounded across states, with their every move scrutinized. That sense of freedom that Dutch always preached about was gone. The haunting part of the Blackwater Ferry Job is how it lingers over the gang's story. Every time Arthur reflects on Dutch's choices, every moment where the gang grows more divided, it all traces back to that night. It wasn't just a failed robbery. It was a turning point. It was the moment Dutch's vision of a free life for his people collided with the reality of progress, modern law, and his own pride. The dream of one last score didn't give them a future. It condemned them to a slow, painful downfall. And that's why the ferry job is so important in the lore of Red Dead Redemption 2. Even though we never see it, its shadow is everywhere. In the gang's mistrust, in Dutch's increasingly desperate promises, and in Arthur's growing doubt. Blackwater wasn't just the place they were banned from. It was the graveyard of Dutch's legend, and the beginning of the gang's inevitable end.